Well, on tonight's debate, on one side, prayer, seething anger, and outrage. And on the other, a feeling of vindication, and even a sense that, like it or not, justice was done. The acquittal by a Florida jury of George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch volunteer, in the 2012 shooting death of a black teenager, Trayvon Martin, has reignited a now familiar debate in the United States about race, crime, and whether the rule of law applies equally to all members of society at all times. 20 years ago, you might remember, the brutal beating by Los Angeles police of Rodney King, a black construction worker, after a high-speed car chase, provoked riots in America's second largest city. Now, that type of violence hasn't been repeated, at least yet, this time around. Protesters did rally in cities across the U.S. after the not guilty verdict against Zimmerman was announced late on Saturday. From Boston to Denver to a mass gathering in New York City, where thousands marched to Times Square, chanting justice for Trayvon Martin. Now in Los Angeles, the scene of the Rodney King riots, things got tense at one point between police and protesters. To many, Zimmerman's acquittal underlined a sense that despite America's electing and then re-electing a black president, the first black president, the country's racism is deep-rooted as ever. The president himself appealed for calm. In a statement, Obama said that we are a nation of laws, and a jury has spoken. I now ask every American to respect the call for calm reflection from two parents who lost their young son. And as we do, we should ask ourselves if we're doing all we can to widen the circle of compassion and understanding in our own communities. Well, joining me tonight to sort of debate these questions and really try to decide, was Trayvon Martin's killing due to a tragic combination of racism, hatred, and permissive gun laws? Or was it just legitimate self-defense? Here in the studios with me tonight, on my right, Andrew Diamond, a professor of American history and civilization at Paris Sorbonne, here in Paris, obviously. Welcome. And on my left, Curtis Young, welcome to the show as well. You're a professor of geopolitics at the American Business School, also based here in Paris. And way outside the studio, joining me by satellite from Washington, D.C., we have Eric LISANN, legal analyst, frequent guest on our shows, former U.S. federal prosecutor. Welcome, Eric. You're going to help us hash through and splice and dice all of the legal aspects of this case, things that I probably understand very little about and that you could sort of set us straight on. I want to cut to the chase here, and I want to start with you, Curtis. Civil rights leaders are furious about the outcome of this case, and not just civil rights leaders, people across the United States. Basically, they say it is classic racial profiling. A young man wearing a hooded sweatshirt, carrying soft drink and some candy, walking home at night to the place he was staying in a neighborhood, and all of a sudden being targeted and attacked, presumably because he was guilty for WHWB, walking home while black. Mm-hmm. Is that what it boils down to?
That's what it boils down to. And civil rights leaders are rightfully outraged. We should all be outraged. Here's a kid, as you just laid out, walking down the street, chatting with a friend, by the way, on his cell phone, and being followed by a man. Now, put yourself in the same situation that you're being followed by a man, which is part of the narrative here. You're going to react in one way or another. What's going on? Why am I being followed? What's happening here? Then we don't know what happens next. But we end up with the kid being shot. And then shot and then put on trial for his own murder, essentially.
For his own murder. And Eric, I want to cut to you in Washington, because a lot of people pointed out, a lot of legal experts pointed out to the fact that this was an all-white, all-female, but also all-white jury. Correct me if I'm wrong. And that from the beginning, even if the prosecution might not have had concrete proof or solid evidence, things seem to be weighted in the favor of the defense.
It's hard to tell, based strictly on superficial racial characteristics. They were all female, and there was one Hispanic. The process seemed to work correctly in that the evidence came out as a trial should, and the proof to support the charges of murder, the main charge of second-degree murder, wasn't there. And this was probably a strategical mistake that was very serious on the part of the prosecution. Another problem here is that this was only a 6-member jury. Very few states allow only 6 members. Florida is one of the few. There had even been a constitutional challenge to that process back in the 70s. The Supreme Court said in no circumstance can you go under 6, but having a minimum of 6 might be the least you can do to assure diversity in the community and the diversity of opinion that is necessary to bring to the jury. These are some of the factors that came into play here.
Could you just give us a sense quickly, Eric? I know the prosecution had a very high burden of proof here. Could you lay out, just in clear terms, what was the burden of proof? What would they have had to prove to get a guilty verdict?
The criminal standard of proof is the highest in the law. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. While that does not mean it has to be proven to a mathematical certainty or 100% certainty, it is something approaching that, and it is very high. And in this kind of a case, it's not unusual for a failure to meet that burden to occur. And this is something the defense hammered on, and why the state or the prosecution in these types of cases has a difficult job and has to think through the charges and the presentation of evidence very carefully. They didn't do that in this case, and that contributed to the problem.
Andrew, I want to ask you and bring in Barack Obama here, because we heard before his reaction to this, the appeal for calm reflection. It was the rule of law. Jury spoke. Respect the jury. It would seem to me that Obama's in a bind here, right? He was elected as a black president, but he's always sort of tried to pitch himself as a non-racial president. A rock and a hard place.
Absolutely. He's been in a bind since he was elected president, in the sense that I think it's almost been more difficult for him as the first black president to actually talk about racial issues because he's black. And really, ever since the first days of his campaign, he's spoken in a language of colorblindness. Early in the campaign, when he was asked if he thought race would play a role if he loses, he said, "If I lose, I'm the one who's to blame. It's me alone." And that's really been his discourse all along, a combination of colorblindness and emphasis on personal responsibility, a somewhat conservative language, in fact.
But yet, given the precedents of a lot of the cases throughout American history, is it really possible to be colorblind in the American legal system if you look at?
Well, certainly the statistics don't bear that out. I mean, and that's really what's problematic right now. Is there's a great disjuncture between this language of colorblindness, which many Americans embrace, especially the right, and I think the president, and the statistics, which show incredible inequalities and injustices, specifically in the American justice system.
This is interesting, and I want to actually, if we could play it now. Barack Obama, last year, when he was speaking about this case, shortly after it broke, he spoke directly to the Martin Traven issue, and he identified with Martin Traven. And I'd just like our viewers to take a listen to what he said at the time. I believe it was in March of last year. Barack Obama then.
Is to the parents of Trayvon Martin. You know, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. And, you know, I think they are right to expect that all of us as Americans are going to take this with the seriousness it deserves, and that we're going to get to the bottom of exactly what happened.
Curtis Young, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. That's a direct identification with him.
Yeah.
He was personally identifying with this case.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if he had a son, he would look like Trayvon. There's no question. And the thing is, and I saw an interesting headline in the New York Daily News, which showed a hood, and it had a list of men's names. I wrote them down. Emmett Till, that was 1955, Money, Mississippi, flirted with a white woman, lynched. Willie Edwards, 1957, 24-year-old kid, Alabama, KKK. James Chaney, Michael Donald, they listed, last recorded lynching, 1981, Mobile, Alabama. Michael Griffin, Queens, New York, 1986, one of 2 young men who were killed by a mob in New York, the other one being Yusef Hawkins, 16 years old, 1989, Bensonhurst, James Byrd, most recent, dragged on the back of a truck. So the thing is that these continue. And the question is when is it going to end? That's I think is connected to the president saying that if he had a kid.
It would be like, and I'm sorry, I just want to bring have Eric LISANN in Washington respond to that. That Daily News headline, what we were just hearing from Curtis, makes it sound like there was some sense of sort of a historical string of injustices, of legal injustices being done to black men in America. Yet the defense claims in this case, the prosecution simply didn't have a case.
Well, they're correct that the prosecution didn't present the case, obviously, in a way that could have convinced a jury chosen at random from the community. There is, at the same time, a very disturbing history and legacy of gross miscarriages of justice. The question is, does this case fit that pattern? I'm not sure the answer is so simple. There weren't any grotesque errors, so to speak, in the way the jury was constituted. There wasn't an intent demonstrably on any side not to bring this case. Indeed, it's clear that the state of Florida brought forth their full prosecutorial armada, so to speak, to bring this case. I think that distinguishes it from other cases, from these other cases that have been cited. Also, since then, since the riots in the Rodney King case, we saw the verdict in the O.J. Simpson criminal case, where a black defendant was acquitted, and we've seen another string of acquittals in other high-profile cases. So to a certain extent, we know that any time a case goes to a jury, it's a roll of the dice.
Okay, Eric,
and nobody can say precisely what happened here.
Eric, I'm going to jump in because Curtis has his hand up very patiently.
No, it's just that this whole situation is mitigated by certain events. The event happened. Zimmerman went to the Florida police station and was let go. He was released. It took the outrage of the community weeks before he was even arrested. So the assumption going in of Zimmerman's right to do what he had done and the assumption of his innocence of this has prevailed from the beginning all the way through to the end.
It only took pressure to bring him.
Exactly.
And I'll get to him 1 second, Andrew. I just want to ask Eric one last thing. A key plank, I believe, of the defense argument was the legitimate self-defense, and they used the Florida Stand Your Ground law. I just want to quickly show our viewers, if I can. I think we have what the Florida Stand Your Ground law. It's a special self-defense law that's actually been adopted by 20 states, I believe, in the nation, in the United States. If we could bring it up on the screen, that would be great. If not, I could tell our viewers what it's about. Basically giving defendants, here it comes now, a person who's not engaged in an unlawful activity and who is attacked in any other place where he or she has a right to be, has no duty to retreat and has the right to stand his or her ground and meet force with force, including deadly force, if he or she reasonably believes it is necessary to do so to prevent death or great bodily harm to himself or herself or another, or to prevent the commission of a forcible felony. I know that's a mouthful, but it's a very important mouthful because you notice in there that even if the attacker, Eric LISANN, is running away, is retreating, in Florida, you can still shoot.
Well, if that is in fact the interpretation of the law, and we need more judicial interpretations of it because everybody's opining on both directions, that could be disturbing. What is very disturbing here is that Zimmerman appeared to be an activity which was not reasonable. It was a type of reckless endangerment, what in the vernacular we would say felony stupid or criminal stupid. Normally, we don't criminalize stupid activity. But when the activity rises to the level of significantly elevating the risk of harm to people around oneself or death, as was the case in this case, can we still call it reasonable? This is really the question that the prosecution should have been honing in on. It might not have led to a murder conviction, but it should have led to a manslaughter conviction. And that's where the debate really needs to be focused. If there's a civil case, we'll again have the chance to revisit this issue of these stand your ground laws, and the public should weigh in. Laws come from the legislature, which are directly answerable to the people that vote them in. And the public has to weigh in as to whether this is the kind of law they really want.
I want to ask Andrew this. There are federal hate crime laws in the United States. The Obama administration has prosecuted people under these hate crime laws. It's been sometimes reluctant. But would you say that the record of the Obama administration is generally favorable when it comes to civil rights leaders pressing to have cases heard and then those cases getting heard?
Well, I'm not sure it is. I mean, the Black Caucus has pressed Obama constantly during his administration to take a much more aggressive stand on civil rights issues. And again, the president, and I'm restating what I've previously said, the president has stuck to a very colorblind discourse. He's wanted to avoid racial issues ever since the first days of his campaign. And, you know, this is a political hot potato. And I am not sure that he's going to move aggressively on this either.
Then, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, it looks like we're a little bit stuck right now, right? And just let me give a sense of how stuck we might be. We have a couple of tweets that people tweeted into our Twitter account here, reacting to this case. One is, let's see if we could bring it up. Someone who calls himself FTL Slacker. Can we bring up FTL? Well, actually, we have someone, Valdelamar, first. Let's see. It says, murdered for being black, double question mark. We're talking about racism. And then there's one that takes exactly the opposite. Can we bring up the first one, who takes the opposite tack, which is, yeah, this is FTLS Slacker. Why is shooting a guy who is beating you up racism? Because the guy was black? Curtis?
See, this is the question that I'm surprised that we're not talking about. The idea is the kid was beating up Zimmerman. Why? Zimmerman was following this kid for no, as far as the kid was concerned. Who is this guy that's following me? What's going on? I have to defend myself. As you read the stand your ground law, it seems to me it applies more to Martin than it did to Zimmerman, in that Zimmerman was apparently the aggressor here.
Let me wait. I just have to ask Eric. Listen, if you just heard that, were there any circumstances here? Does the law actually give Trayvon Martin? Would it have given Trayvon Martin a chance to stand his ground?
Well, it should have if the law was applied in the way some people are putting forth that it should be applied. And I agree that this, in fact, was something that the prosecution did not confront directly. They seem to have been afraid to approach that issue, perhaps because politically there was some pressure not to do anything to put the wisdom of this type of a law into play. But there was a great deal of debate, which I think was a red herring, as to who was the aggressor, whose voice do we hear crying out for help on the video. Trayvon Martin was perfectly legitimate in challenging Zimmerman if that's what he did. Even if he texted, in fact, some creepy guy is following me, anybody would reasonably think that under these circumstances. Does that mean that Zimmerman would have had the right to pull out a gun and shoot him? No, of course not. That by itself does not mean that. So instead of portraying Zimmerman as a helpless child who was hunted down and shot in cold blood solely because of his race, well, we don't know that that's exactly what happened.
Eric,
it was something probably a little bit more complex. The verdict might have been different.
Eric, we're going to have to leave it there for now. We're going to have to jump to a break, but we will be back very shortly, and we're going to take up this conversation again, looking a little bit at the broader context in civil rights history in the U.S. You're watching the debate here on France 24.